All right, we are going to get started. I know I'm starting a few seconds early, but I figure why not just get started. If you're joining us, you're here for our webinar today on using data for call centers and how to leverage that data to really get the most out of it. I'm Luke Stanke. I lead the analytics practice here at phData. I'm joined by Megan, Dave, and James, who I will give broader intros to in a second. I just wanted to, before we get started, sort of talk a little bit about phData and our offering. So just real quick, we are a data product services company. We focus on both the data and analytics components of what we put together. We have over 325 employees across the US and India. We are centrally located in Minneapolis, but our team is all over the United States, all over India, but the headquarters is here in Minneapolis. And we have done thousands of projects up until now in terms of supporting everything from Tableau, Snowflake, and well beyond that as well. So like I said, today we are joined by Megan, Dave, and James. Megan has been working in analytics for over 5 years. They've used tools like Tableau and Alteryx for solving complex problems for clients, particularly in operations, in call centers, warehousing, shipping industry. And they've helped build a operations center of excellence and culture around and using data literacy to help drive decision making. We've got Dave here as well. Dave has been using analytics for about 8 years or over 8 years in his career, and is focused on accounting and finance, and has used those methods for automation. I think most interestingly, Dave on this call, as he started his career, helped actually lead a call center, and then in the next phase, actually took that information and took that, what he knew about running a call center, and used it to drive operations and leverage that data for key decision making. And then James has spent basically his entire career, data career, in call center analytics, and has run essentially, or helped support, a Fortune 5 company in terms of their analytics for call center. So he has done pretty much everything when it comes down to it when we are talking here today. I've sort of laid out these intros. So I do want to start out, get things rolling here, and lead with a question for James is, what is the status quo for contact centers look like, and how is data being used today?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Well, I will give you kind of a 10,000-foot view, the lay of the landscape in terms of what's important to a call center operation, whether it's a small scale, large scale. There are certain commonalities that cross all sorts of different companies. Success in running a call center is ultimately about making sure that you've got the right number of people in the right place at the right time with the right training to answer a call and resolve an issue when you pick up your phone for help from a company. In order to make that happen, you're constantly making decisions all of the time. Active management is a must. And it's happening in real time. It's happening weeks, months, over a year ahead of time. So call centers bigger than staff of about 100 or so are typically going to have some sort of scheduling software that'll help you to manage shifts and schedule on and offline activities throughout the day for the staff, so that you'll have enough people ready when that peak hits. But there's generally always data that's siloed across systems that you have to integrate. You have to pull it together to create an analysis that you need to make decisions on an ongoing basis. And there's usually going to be at least 3 or 4, often many more than that, platforms that all have data that you need to integrate for that critical work and analysis to happen. So way ahead of time, over a year in advance, you'll have a long-range planning team that's going to create a high-level view of staffing and strategy for the call center. It's a high-level plan, it's usually by month and overall business segment, and it's going to tie back to a financial budget typically. and it's going to be updated anywhere from on a quarterly basis to a monthly basis. It's going to vary a little bit. But from there, a short range plan or a planning team will evaluate the most recent data and trends and turn those high level plans into more detailed weekly, daily level plans down to the individual team from the segment. And these plans are intended to minimize service risk. So you might start to deviate a little from the financial plan, but you need line of sight into what changed and why, and how are you going to make those changes. They're going to forecast things like call volume, which is based on metrics like contact rate, what's your overall membership or customer population, and how often are they calling in, and what's driving that. They're looking at average handle time for calls, the availability of employees throughout the day to take calls based on their scheduled phone time, their offline activities, and then other factors like occupancy, which is how often are they spending twiddling their thumbs between calls waiting for the next one to come in. You need some, but you obviously don't want too much, because then you become inefficient and you're spending production hours for no benefit. You're looking at overall efficiency gained based on scale of your staffing groups and based on cross utilization of how our teams helping each other. Being able to see and quantify those things is important. And then in the time frame of weeks to days, you've got a scheduling team. They're going to determine shift assignments and daily schedule activities for the call center employees. Their job is to align those schedules so that available phone time closely matches the curve of required hours throughout each day. So you minimize that idle time in between calls. And then in real time, you're making even more decisions. You're monitoring call queues to see how many calls are waiting to be answered at a given moment and how much staff is available to take calls in those various queues. Smaller call centers might just have a handful of queues, but larger ones can have thousands. So you have staff actively managing queue assignments, priorities for those queues for each staff member. And then you're determining who takes what calls, who gets those calls first. And then what if things don't go according to plan? Well, you need to have a playbook defined of activities that you agree upon in advance so you can get help on the phones from supervisors, trainers, other staff, backup areas as a contingency, so that you have a plan if and when things don't go according to plan. And then on top of that, you've got business continuity planning. If a site needs to close due to an emergency or a weather event, what are you going to do? You need to have a plan for all of that. So there's a complex planning and execution that needs to occur at every single level in order to ensure success. And you obviously need strong analytics in order to make that happen. Any point of variance can cause breakage in the whole system. So your ability to see all of these things, integrate them, and use them to respond and make decisions is what's critical to success there.
So you've sort of brought up all these ways that right now organizations are having to drive and optimize their call centers. I'm curious what the behind the scenes looks like in terms of what is the team or group of individuals, teams that are supporting operations. What do they do? Like, what are they do? Like, how do they do the analysis that they're doing?
Yeah, so there's a constant tug of war between having insufficient staff in any moment where calls are piling up in queue, they're waiting longer and longer. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have too much staff that's sitting largely unoccupied while waiting for that next call to come in to be routed from the IVR. So you're constantly making those decisions as to how do you shift resources in any given moment, because you can't just instantly hire someone to work tomorrow. You have to plan when that training class is going to come in. So you are evaluating, do I want it on this week or that week? Which site do I have it at? Where am I going to train them in specifically? How long is the class? How long is it going to take them to really get efficient with those calls once the class is done? So you've got a training ramp, we call an AHT training curve. So it might take twice as long to handle a call right out of training. And then you have to feather that in. You have to make that work in your plans and account for those things and measure them and have visibility into them. One of the first lessons that I learned when working in call center operations was the importance of quick action in the real-time sense of things. So you can't wait to make a decision when an action is needed, even if you're not 100% certain it's the right one to make, because you can't afford to wait. You'll spend 10 times more resources and staffing and overtime and everything else to make up when one variable changes and then suddenly your queues are blowing up.
I would just ask to the group as we sort of go through this question. It's something that's lingered in my mind, and we've talked about in prep even for this, is what's the one thing that most individuals who are working with the call center teams, well, you all have worked there. I have less personal experience in it. So what's the one thing most people don't understand when supporting a contact center? What's the sort of the underlying piece of information that most people are getting wrong? And when I say people, that being the teams that are supporting the broader team supporting the call center.
I can give my 2 cents on that one. I think one of the big misconceptions is that the data is readily available and easy to access and easy to put together into, decision makers' hands. I think the more you get into any department, you find that that's not the case, but I think it's particularly true for things like call centers, where a lot of times, even capturing what that customer is calling about can be extremely difficult or require some kind of technology to be able to take their speech and translate that to text and into analytics. Something like that is a standalone product that I think a lot of people don't understand or take the time to invest in. But it may be necessary if you're really trying to figure out why people are calling and improve your business. And that's just one example.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. So sort of given the tight timeline for this call, it's hard to believe it goes by so quick. Dave, I'd target a question for you here, which is, what have been the key motivators in terms of driving change at call centers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of this has to do with the advances in technology, not only in the ERP systems like James brought up, but in changes to how the customers are getting in contact with the contact centers. Is it going to be by phone like in the olden days? Is it going to be by chatbot, by social media? How is this coming in? And then how are you going to consolidate that and bring it in to do data analytics on that? And it's not only just monitoring the phones and stuff like that. Now, like James said, with the staffing planning, there's staffing shortages that are definitely driving change. They're having to take a look and see how can we be the most efficient with our staffing that's available. Between COVID and the effects we've seen in the pandemic and the Great Resignation, where a lot of people are leaving jobs, staffing's at a very difficult point. So definitely using our analytic tools to our advantage can help get the staff that we have and get them in the right place at the right time.
I'm probably jumping ahead here a little bit, but just a slight, diving into that topic is, how do you get organizations? So I'm imagining, let's say you're a laggard in the adoption phase of data and technology, and you're having to work in a call center. How do you get that initial buy-in? Where's the area where you're focusing your time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that getting the calls to the right people at the right time has a lot to do with it, and understanding like how you route calls can, make such an impact on your actual resources that you're spending. If you're getting the calls to the right people, then you're not having people spend time on the phone guiding them through all the departments. So establishing like a good infrastructure to get the calls inbound, or the whatever leads you may have, is going to get it to the right people, and then you can see immediate impact on your resources there in terms of how many hours you're spending and how much effort you're putting into everyday calls.
And diving in even deeper, what are they like? And this is for everyone, by the way. What do the analytics look like, or like what's the data product that you're putting together to help support that case in this case?
So I'd say a lot of what it takes to drive the adoption of increased, more robust analytics culture within call center workforce management operations. I think, like a lot of things, it starts with showing improving the ROI, which takes analytics to get there. So you kind of have to get a little bit of a jump start. Like a lot of times the reality is things are done in spreadsheets, like they're from every level, the small to large, like they're inescapable to a degree. But when you rely on just regular processes to be able to scale and change at the rate that, all the things that Dave was talking about, all of those demands to be able to adjust and, pivot quickly. If you're tied to spreadsheets that are increasingly complex and they're linked to this and that, and you don't have just a backbone of here's all my data in one place in Snowflake, let's say, to be able to say, I need to join my data from Avaya with NICE or whatever your stack looks like to present a whole all-in picture. That's what it's going to take. So building analytics to demonstrate a case on ROI to say, yeah, if we spend this money, we're going to make it back through reduced costs in the call center. We're going to increase our occupancy while maintaining our service levels. We're going to improve quality of customer experience so that our churn rate diminishes. All of whatever downstream impacts look like for your business, because the call center it's the face of the company. When someone calls, they're not talking to whoever it is on their phone. You're talking to the company.
And for me, that's where I've always seen the value in the contact center here, is that in today's era of where customers prefer a generally contactless experience, a web experience, a digital experience, and something goes not the way that it was planned, you have to get on the phone, or whether it's via chat, via call, and you have to be in contact with an individual at an organization, and they are the only representative now. They represent the entire organization. So it is critical to get things right 100%. And taking that topic, I actually want to, Megan, ask you a question, is like, where do you see from all of this where call centers should be investing in data and analytics? We talked about essentially one case, but more broadly speaking, what's your opinion?
Well, when I think about this question, I think there's actually kind of two different investments that need to happen. One is just knowledge in the business. So understanding what goes on in a call center, having executives understand the importance of that, getting away from this idea of thinking about a call center as a cost center only. You should be looking at that as a really valuable source of data that you wouldn't otherwise get. You wouldn't get that direct access to customers and what their problems are, what they're noticing. So just really understanding that that's valuable, and then acting accordingly and starting to invest with technology. Now, for the technology side, I think a lot of people, they say, oh, we need analytics, we need to have some data visualization, we need dashboards to inform us about what's going on with contact centers. So they think we need to invest in Tableau. But what they don't see is like everything that needs to happen upstream of that. We mentioned in an earlier question, data being siloed is a common problem for call centers. So that initial solution might actually start with a DE project or data engineering, where you invest in something like Snowflake. You have people like data engineers trying to bring all that data together and put it in a place where then you can run analytics on it. In fact, Luke, if you want to pull up a sample dashboard that I built, this kind of showcases a really great way. This is something I've built out in Tableau, which might be like an executive level view. So what literally executives are looking at, you can see different ways that customers are contacting, whether it's call, chat, email, escalations that happen off of that. But what an executive might not understand is that this is likely coming from probably 4 different places. So calls, that information might be coming from your phone system. Chats, that might be coming from a chat system or integration with like Salesforce, for instance. Emails could be coming through another platform. Escalations probably managed in another CRM, right? So these could all be in a different place that we need to bring together in order to create this view. So that, I think, just really, again, those 2 things, investing in the idea of the value of call centers in terms of your company's culture, and then the technology to make something like this happen. I think you're on mute, Luke.
And this is the value of having multi-screen and trying to get to unmute. I would just say, I think what the interesting piece here, and to highlight even from any dashboard, just to, when we think about what not just executives, but the call center in general is looking for is, yeah, there is some level of understanding the volume, but even more important is sort of the second level metric that you have across all different forms of communication, which is the variance, which James and Dave have alluded to as well, which is you plan and your goal is to have as little variance to the plan as possible, because you're using that information to essentially identify the appropriate number of resources to have on site. And if it's not correct, you're going to run into additional challenges in terms of how you're supporting your customers, which then if we think about what that looks like at the end state, it could be longer wait times, a much more challenging customer experience, because as we all know, one hard call can lead to a lot of resources being used to solve that one call, and therefore affecting sort of downstream the additional support that's available. So I'm curious to hear we've got this dashboard we've shown here. What are some additional use cases, Dave, James, that you're hearing about? Or I shouldn't even say hearing about, that you've worked with.
Yeah, so if you'd like it, obviously you got in the deck some examples that I put together based on some of my previous work in particularly focusing on capacity planning and service risk mitigation. So some of the things that are critical, as Luke mentioned, is just managing to variance, and what are not just like how many calls did we get, what's the sum of calls, but what are the factors that the upstream factors that are going to influence call volume, like contact rate. And in the context of the staffing plan, you've got it's this tug of war, as I mentioned, between your requirements and your capacity. And so understanding what's going to increase your requirements and understanding what's going to affect your capacity. There's so many different variables that affect how those are going to meet and ultimately create breakage or favorability. So this is a view of something you might look at to kind of get a lay of the landscape in terms of what are the factors that are influencing capacity and requirements, and are they stable or not? Are we seeing a lot of variance in the way that we're forecasting? Do we need to look at different methods? What's causing variation in our process that is essentially trying to take something that is very chaotic and create predictability around it. And Luke, if you want to go to that waterfall, I think that really helps to explain at a glance, this might not be self-explanatory, but I think it's actually a pretty powerful way to view what goes on in a call center. So each of these lines up and down, so anything blue is good, anything black is bad, basically is what it comes down to, favorable or unfavorable breakage. And on the outsides, you start with the financial plan, and then it goes inside to the service plan, and then you go into what actually happened. And then if you can see if you made it or not, and that will directly correlate to your results. So if you can manage each individual bar in this chart, in terms of predicting what it's going to look like and managing variance of each of those variables, that is going to get the whole thing under control. So that's what I'm talking about when managing variability, managing the impacts to what happened. And it's also important to be able to understand why did things happen the way they did. So root cause analysis, you can't just ignore that and say the past is the past, we're going to keep looking forward. If you can't explain why things happened the way they did, you won't be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. And views like this that incorporate data across silos. So like your long range plan is going to be often in a different place, usually in spreadsheets. Then your short range plan is going to be different than your scheduling system, which is going to be different than what you're getting out of the switch. And you have to pull all of those together into the same place in order to create a view like this. And you have to create effectively a pipeline that's going to make this repeatable. And that's a process. There's a lot that goes into making that happen and successful. You also have to consider like mapping of relationships across all of those systems. Like your queues are going to change over time. They're going to go away. You're going to add new ones. They're going to get repurposed. Your staff is going to change. Your structure of business is going to change. And you need controls to be able to manage all that so you don't lose your history, so you can benefit from it instead of it becoming a complexity that you have to work around. Dave or Megan, anything that you'd want to add?
I actually thought of another major use case, which is call deflection. I think a lot of companies have different ways in which they try to handle that, how they measure success. But like ideally, most people would agree you don't want your contacts to grow at the same rate as your business. I've seen some companies try to handle that by just making it very hard to contact them, which I think, it should be pretty obvious, but no customer interaction does not equal a good customer experience, right? So I think, finding ways to actually understand, have a pipeline from that data coming in from the customer to what you're going to do about it. I think that pipeline is extremely important.
One question that we sort of leaned into in the prep for this is a little bit about it's been brought up a little bit in this call, but I wanted to make it more explicit. And the question we led with was, what are the assumptions and the implications of the data that are required for these types of analysis that we've been brought up? I think it's really important for any organization to understand if they work towards building products like we've discussed, what do they need to be doing with their data behind the scenes? Again, we've sort of talked about it a little bit, but being really explicit here.
One thing that I think is not always immediate, doesn't pop to the front of mind for a lot of companies is, they're going to have different software solutions for different areas of this process that we've been discussing. And you need to make sure that they're all working and that they're accurate and they're producing models that are accurately describing not just what's going to happen, but what did happen. So kind of bootstrapping or putting real data into the model and seeing what you get out. Like, does it actually describe events as they happened? Is your model accurate? That's something that's important to understand. It's kind of overlooked. I've seen like some solutions that assume its own accuracy, and unless you are taking steps to validate that or even make that an input into your process, like what was the accuracy and what's the variation on accuracy of my short-range planning model, or the requirement pattern generated by my scheduling software, or whatever the case might be. So any part of the process that can introduce variance is something you need to see and measure and predict.
So we sort of talked about data sources and talked about some of the products created. To me, the next question becomes here, and this is for Dave, or what are the impacts to the business if they do get all of these things right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one of the biggest part is balanced staffing and getting the right people at the right time. As James kind of talked about it earlier, you want to be efficient, but you also need to meet your customer needs. So you don't want people waiting on the phone for an hour or having to take all that time out of their day to get their question answered. You want to be able to respond quickly while balancing out, your staffing needs there. And another thing would be, kind of tying into that would be, as Megan talked about, the call deflection. If you're getting the calls handled before they come in, whether it be like an FAQ on your website right before they're able to reach out and actually contact you, and they get their question answered that way, that's one way to do it. But at the same time, you don't want to challenge them and make it impossible for them to come into contact with you. So figuring out the balance there, as well as, service remediation, again, as James said earlier, as you solve these problems before they start coming into your call center, and understanding that, hey, if we can get this taken care of now, it's going to save us a lot more effort down the road. So identifying problems as they come up quickly by using your call center, and as that turns around to your operations team, you're able to call it out, get the right people working on it, and that stops your call center team from having to put in more effort and resources to resolving customer complaints after they've happened. Whereas your operations team can make sure that the problems are getting eliminated before the problem occurs.
Awesome. Now, I think an interesting comment will come up along the way here, which is all this is great. My organization outsources essentially all their call and contact center operations. So James, I guess the question is for you here is, if an organization is doing that, what should they still be doing or considering, even when everything is generally outsourced?
Yeah, so that can come in different flavors, different models, right? So you might have a shop that they outsource basically all of their call center operations, or you might have a shop where it's partially outsourced, where you've got an internal kind of core staff, and then you leverage additional vendor support to help handle like seasonal peaks, where it just doesn't make sense to hire for the peak. But you want that core staff because there's trade-offs, in terms of going internal versus going external. So that can look like a lot of different things, but having a strong analytics stack in either case is going to be really critical to managing that relationship, because it is a relationship and it's one that's built on trust. And being able to provide transparency in terms of, here are the metrics that we're seeing, here's what's expected, here's how it's tracking to our contract. Like you're going to have, just depending on how that looks, you might have financial penalties if there's a service level miss or a staffing requirement miss, or any of the inputs, any of the things that you would expect performance-wise out of that vendor, to make sure they're hiring enough people at the right time, or that their AHT is within the range that, whatever those control points are, you need to be able to clearly see, are we making this or not? Provide transparent, reporting back to the vendor or the partner that you're working with. All of those things, like, it's just equally important. And again, most of this happens in the spreadsheets. And the ability to bake it into your analytics model. If you've got data going into a warehouse that is supporting the rest of your analytics, it's natural for it to flow out of that. And then, and that's a sign of like analytics maturity, is being able to have a process for being able to handle changes to the business. And that's a sign of health. If you can turn quickly and do it well, because it's not if, but when you will need to do that, that's what's going to lead you to success, rather than having to break all the broken links in your spreadsheets.
Yeah, we're getting close to the end here with our session. But before we get to our last wrap-up question, I do want to take a second for each of the three of you to think through, and is there anything that in our planning for this session that we've talked about here that you want to add in that might be a net new point to consider? Of course, I've thrown this one in for a loop here, but so if the answer is, I think we've covered the key points, that's great. But if there's something else that we're all thinking about, or something that's come up, I would say, like, what is that? What's the one thing we could be adding to this conversation?
I think I have one point. We kind of touched on two different things, but I don't think we touched on how they tie together, which is, the contact deflection and staff turnover. Because in my past, what I've experienced, if we're always having the same problems, customers are always calling in with the same issues, or maybe they're calling in angry, that takes a toll on your staff. And so I think, the smarter we can be about, making sure that people are calling in when they actually do need help, and it's not like a technology error, it's not something else that we could have fixed, that can really do wonders for your staff and reduce turnover as well. So I think just understanding that relationship is one point that I wanted to make sure was brought up.
And that is the constant challenge, right? The underlying poll here is you have to balance customer satisfaction with the costs of running a team and having turnover. And therefore, it's a very complex challenge to have to overcome for many, many organizations in this case. James, I will ask, I know we have another view that we had put together. Do you want to, if I share a little bit about the planning view, would you want to walk through that for just a minute here before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Yeah, so this one is kind of a typical view that you would see that it's often referred to as like a 613 sort of view, which would be the previous 6 weeks of history, and then 13 or sometimes more. It just depends on how it's done in whatever particular shop. But you're looking at the past and the future, and you're looking at all of those factors that influence variance of what's gonna increase or decrease our capacity, what's going to increase or decrease our requirements or our demand. And being able to have basically visibility like this, where you can see all those factors over time. You can drill into from weeks into individual days, sometimes from days into individual intervals within that day, if you're like in kind of an operations view, and also being able to slice across the business. So you can view everything at once, or you can drill into a particular site or a particular like area of operations, particular call type, or individual staffing groups. It's going to be able to increase your visibility into what's going on and where the risk is, because that's what all of this is kind of bringing us toward, is where's the risk? Do I need to take action? What's that action going to look like? And this is an example. There's other things that you could put in this, like schedule adherence. Like typically, like you might lose up to 5% of your scheduled open time due to just people taking longer breaks or not taking them at the right times. Things like that. Different systems are going to measure time differently. Sometimes you get this many hours out of your switch and you get this many hours out of your workforce management. And there's a little bit of a difference that you have to account for and how you're going to do that. But having the right tools for the job is what's key here, because when there's so much that can go wrong and so much that's at stake, just from like, even with, like we were talking about call centers as generally a cost center, like you have to make the case for the funding that you need to be successful. And you do that by demonstrating ROI, by saying like, here's what we can do and here's how we're going to do it. Like if you have things like system downtime, that's increasing your average handle time, where something's running slow and calls are taking longer because you're waiting for screens to load. That has an impact. That has an impact on how the call center runs. It has an impact on the customer experience too. So all those things, like you need to use analytics and visibility like this in order to demonstrate the ROI to fund your call center, so it can be a great place to work for the people who work there and a great place to interact with as a customer. That's the ultimate goal.
It's a great way to both dive in and sort of bring to the surface exactly what we're sort of working here to do. I wanted to be cognizant of everyone's time and try to wrap up in 45 minutes here today. So we're going to start wrapping things up. But as we do so, I'm hoping, Megan, you can just sort of talk through, like, to reiterate to the audience here, what are sort of 2 or 3 points that might be some key, I don't want to call them takeaways, but just the things to reiterate to the audience here.
Yeah, just picking a couple. I mean, there's so many important things I think we've talked about, but recognizing the value of the contact center data itself, making sure that we capture that. And then understanding, everything that James was showing, it seems like very, very detailed. Well, those details are necessary. They help you have a successful call center, because nothing like a call center has to react that quickly, right? We don't have any other instance where less than a minute you have to respond, right? And to something unknown nonetheless. So I think paying attention to those details, really learning about them, understanding why they're important, making sure you can capture that data to make decisions off of it quickly. I think nothing's more important than that out of everything we've talked about.
Look to James, Dave, any last items that you'd want to add to that list?
Yeah, I think just understanding your structure and building a framework, whether that's with like data engineers or however you're going to set this data analysis up, is, once you have that structure there and you build your reporting based off that, I think that's just so important to understand like how things are flowing in, regardless of the resources, whether it be, through your phone calls. If you're going to do it in a spreadsheet, make sure the spreadsheets are set up strongly. Don't let, any text field go in there, and, anytime the other box gets used for a call type, it's going to throw your analysis off big time.
And James, any last points you would like to add? Otherwise, I'm going to take it to, I've been secretly or not so secretly writing the takeaways to rehammer them home for everyone here. James, any other takeaways you want to add? As I will pull up the screen and we'll see how close I was to everything.
Yeah, kind of along the lines of what Dave was just talking about in terms of data quality, like having a process for mapping your entity relationships over time between different systems, super critical. A lot of people don't think about it, and things get hard coded into your analytics, whether it's a SQL query that you're pulling from a database, and you've got a list of queues in there. Like anytime that changes, you're going to need to go in and do some surgery. Think ahead, be forward thinking in terms of how you create the pipeline of data that's actually going to make it into decision making, and make controls for the things that will need to change, and don't assume that they'll always be static, because things always change. And I'll just add to like, if it's not apparent, like I find call center data and analytics fascinating. Like to me, like the way a call center works, it's like a living organism. Like there's so many outputs that loop back into inputs, and it's kind of like this living, breathing system. If you do poorly, it loops back into poor performance. If you do well, it loops back into success. And that makes it both very difficult to model at times, because you've got these self-correcting, like organic feeling systems, if you can feel metrics, to just being something that's actually, when you see success, it just feels so great to have been a part of something that is like so sensitive to failure, and yet when you pull it off, which requires big successful teams of analytics professionals, it feels great to see it work well.
Awesome. That's an amazing way to begin to wrap things up here. I will just say, if you haven't caught any of the takeaways, the person attempting to look from the outside, again, we've spent a lot of time discussing this topic in general and have supported this type of work very clearly in the past at quite a deep level. The takeaways for me were, number one, from an operations standpoint, quick actions are critical. That means in terms of the data, having something at your fingertips, whether it's the operational side or the actual employee who's supporting the contact, is critical in order to essentially optimize the use of time. And then obviously to do so, it requires that call centers consider the cost, not as a necessary cost, but the cost in terms of collecting the information about the customer. That's the value that it's able to bring. If you're able to bring together these disparate data sources in real time, you can collect even deeper, richer information about a customer, drive up, as James pointed out, with that information, drive up your customer satisfaction score, CSAT. And ultimately, all these things are helping work towards a balanced staffing model, which are, again, supporting positive outcomes for the customer, as well as the costs internally for it. I will just say, again, that same information can then help optimize call deflection, as brought up. And ideally, out of all this, that data is integrating long-term data, long-term planning, short-term planning, and real-time data, which are all on different levels, different systems. And sometimes you need a variety of analytics platforms to support this work. And then ultimately, like, doesn't matter, like all that does matter, but you need to take into account the context of your data. And sometimes that information is not stored anywhere. It's just known knowledge about how your performance looks. And you can, in the long term, that might look like you're indexing some of your metrics over time to say where it's at and considering what to plan relative to that, so that as turnover happens within the operations team, that information is documented somewhere. That said, those are my takeaways from this. I know we've hammered away our takeaways quite a bit here, but we're going to open it up for questions if anyone wants to stick around. But if you do want to reach out to any of us at any point, feel free. Here's our contact information while you're connecting with James, Megan, Dave, or myself. We'll be happy to answer any questions about anything when it comes down to call center analytics for this. So that said, if you've attended, I do appreciate your time. You don't necessarily need to stick around, but the four of us will stick around for a minute to answer any questions that might open up. And again, thanks for attending. So I'm going to read through a question, and then anyone can feel free to answer. If you take a look, it is in chat. This comes from Bill Watts. As a data engineer, a takeaway for non-data engineers is that call center software data and data models are often not geared towards data science and analytics. We do not have a major transformations and assumptions on that data. Not necessarily a question, but just calling out a point which Megan did hit on a few times, but it is, as Bill points out, an important one.
Yeah, within certain platforms, there's often like different ways to look at the same data. Like you can measure average handle time from an agent perspective or from a queue perspective, or same thing with occupancy. And those metrics mean different things, and like it tells a different story depending on what your use case is. So yeah, having a deep understanding of what you're looking at, what it means, and how to use it is important.
All right, with no additional messages coming through, at least from my side, I think we can call this a wrap. Again, if you've stuck around, appreciate it. But from here, I will say you can check out this if you want to get a review of this. I think it's going to be sent via email or something. I forget how these systems work completely, but at the same time, available on our website for access as well. So feel free to connect or check out the website. And don't forget, I think Katie I would be remiss if I didn't say, be sure to check out our dashboard library where many of these examples actually live. And then there was also in chat information for us to connect. So thanks again for everyone for attending today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks all.